In this historic meeting of three of the most important and influential living philosophers, Donald Davidson, Willard Van Orman Quine, and Sir Peter Strawson, Martin Davies, Professor of Philosophy at Oxford University, joins me as co-chair. This was the first time that the three philosophers shared the same podium together, and we decided to try to explore the similarities and differences of the three towards some of the fundamental philosophical issues. I opened the discussion by asking each of them to address what they take to be the role of the skeptic in philosophy. As a corollary to this question, Martin Davies asked Davidson about the comparative roles of the principles of charity and humanity, particularly concerning their potential as grounds in an anti-skeptical argument. This leads to a brief statement by Davidson of the difference between his principle of charity and Quine's principle of empathy. Each philosopher is then asked what he takes to be the relationship between metaphysics and the philosophy of language, particularly which comes first. The discussion then turns to exploring the relationship between formal and natural languages. The final topic concerns whether notions like meaning can be analyzed in terms of notions like belief and intention. For various reasons, the three philosophers agree that it is hopeless to try to reduce meaning to belief. Furthermore, Davidson emphasizes that the program can't even succeed in principle, since to reduce a meaning to a belief, one would have to specify the content of the belief, and that can only be done by employing the notion of meaning. The program was recorded before an invited audience and included at the end are questions from Keith Lehrer of the University of Arizona, Mark Sainsbury of King's College London, and Barry Smith from Birkbeck College London. We now join the discussion at the Centre for Philosophy of the Natural and Social Sciences at the London School of Economics. Well, I'm delighted to welcome you today to this special session at the Centre for Philosophy of the Natural and Social Sciences at the London School of Economics. I'm particularly pleased to have as co-chair Martin Davies, who is Wild Reader of Mental Philosophy at Oxford University and Professor of Philosophy at Oxford University. It's something of a historical event to have our three distinguished guests here. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first time that all three have together shared a podium in the flesh. Their swords have clashed, or at least their pens have, on numerous occasions in print, and none of them are strangers to any of you. But I can assure you that they are, off the camera and outside of the domain of philosophy, the very best of friends, and even within the domain of philosophy. I'd like to extend my warmest welcome to Willard Van Orman Quine, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Harvard University, Sir Peter Strawson, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Oxford University, and to Donald Davidson, Professor of Philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. The role of the skeptic and its place in philosophy, and his place or her place in philosophy, has had a sort of fashion, a role that's very often dictated by fashion of the times. Sometimes it's taken seriously, other times it's taken less seriously. And all three panelists, I think, three guests, I think, share different views, have different views as to the role that the skeptic should play. So I would like to ask each of you to pencil out for us, to sketch out for us in some way what you see the role of the skeptic to be and whether we should take it seriously and so on. So perhaps if I start, Van, could you give us your views of the role of the skeptic in philosophy?
Well, from the point of view of my own present philosophical leanings, the residual role of the skeptic that I can countenance is just the ordinary layman's or scientist's doubts, reservations about the conclusiveness of the scientific hypotheses, scientific theories at hand, a skepticism that will admit of various degrees, and just an ordinary critical attitude. And I think that a naturalistic approach admits of no skepticism beyond that, because to think of skepticism beyond that intra-scientific domain is a matter of exceeding that domain in favor of something transcendental that the naturalist has ex officio repudiated. So so what one grants, it's conceivable in principle that we're way off the beam in our scientific theories, and it's correspondingly unlikely, we feel, that to be the case. But the matter of there being just an inaccessibly different truth of the matter over and above our conceptualization, I would retain enough of the old beyond the circle point of view to say it's meaningless.
And Peter, would you agree,
Yes.
disagree, or have a different picture?
Well, I think the skeptic may play a useful and stimulating role in encouraging able people to think of ingenious arguments against skepticism, attempts to refute classical skepticism about the external world, other minds, etc. But although this may be an amusing exercise, indeed an entertaining and instructive exercise, I think all such arguments are completely futile, because we are, as it were, naturally committed to take for granted and not to question certain general, perfectly general truths, like the existence of the external world, reality of other minds, and so on. And no amount of argument will ever shape this conviction, and therefore no amount of argument is necessary in order to restore it. So I think, though it gives rise to some interesting philosophy, that's it. And in this I find myself in agreement with Hume on the one hand. Nature has taken this to be too important a matter to leave to our idle speculation. And with Wittgenstein on the other, on certainty, when he regards the propositions questioned by the skeptic as the framework or foundation of all our thinking and reasoning, therefore not themselves in question. That's it.
Well, yes, the role of skepticism, for me, I think has been that I thought any philosophical view that leaves us skeptical must be wrong. So it's an instrument of rejection. Now, both Van and Peter said somewhat the same thing. That is, we have to start somewhere. That's where we are. We take for granted that there are other people and that we share a world with them and so forth. That is certainly right, and it may well be that if that's where we start, it certainly has to be where we finish. The only difference I noted was that Van gives more weight to science, whereas Peter gives more weight to common sense. But that's just a difference of weight. It's not a difference of in conclusion. And I think I'm with both of them in thinking that it's pointless to set out to refute the skeptic. My own interest in skepticism came as a byproduct. I mean, aside from just using it as a way of seeing that some position was wrong, I developed a view of my own about our knowledge of the world and of other people, and I saw that if that was right, skepticism couldn't even get started. And that's more than one person has pointed out to me that something like that is in Wittgenstein, especially in uncertainty. And my view is good for him. He got it right.
Donald, viewing your work in a very broad brush kind of way just for a moment, in the early work on interpretation and philosophy of language, the overarching principle which was supposed to constrain interpretation was the principle of charity. Putting it very, very roughly, this is the idea that you make people out to be right so far as possible. And sometimes in the literature there's a slightly different principle with a slightly different name, sometimes called the principle of humanity, which says what's so great about being right if it's not intelligible how you could be right, and what's so bad about being wrong if it's all too intelligible how you came to be wrong. And so you have the idea that rather than maximizing correctness, you maximize some notion of intelligibility. Now, at first blush, it looks as if the first principle, call it the principle of charity, promises more in the way of potential for an anti-skeptical argument than the second. So it was perhaps a little surprising, again, viewing this in a very crude sort of way, that having, as I took it, made a transition from charity to humanity in your own work, it was from that stage that you, as it were, started to launch the project of an anti-skeptical argument. So I wondered if you could say something about the comparative roles of charity and humanity, both in the project of interpretation, but more specifically as regards the prospects for an anti-skeptical argument.
Well, my claim that most of our beliefs must be true was never meant to stand on its own. That is, it was meant to follow from certain considerations, and the idea that the way to exercise charity was to maximize agreement never seemed to me to be a sharply characterized position at all. It was meant to summarize for people who didn't appreciate the importance of interpretation, to get them to see what kind of a role it played. And even in the book that collected some of my early stuff, I said in the introduction, of course, the whole idea of maximizing agreement doesn't make any sense anyway, because we can't count things agreed and disagreed. It would be better to say minimize unexplained disagreement. And as far as I can see, that is the principle of humanity. And I always agreed with what people said when they said, of course, you don't want to maximize agreement. You want to understand both agreement and disagreement. So making the other person intelligible is actually the aim, rather than maximizing agreement. I mean, what more should I say? Charity shows itself in very specific ways, and once it has shown itself in those ways, you don't need the notion of charity anymore. In fact, it never was the right word anyway. It shows itself, first of all, in the identification of another person's logical constants. And there I'm a faithful student of Quine's. There's no way you can fail to attribute to the other person a certain amount of elementary logic. It's not that you're giving them some favor, it's rather that there's no understanding them at all. If you don't suppose that their conjunction is whatever they use to connect two sentences when they agree to the conjunction, if and only if they agree to each of the conjuncts, and so on. The other exercise of charity is entirely different, and it comes in the interpretation or translation of observation sentences, where we can do no better as a basic start than to correlate the sentences that they assent to and dissent from with what we observe in the world along with them. And if we do it that way, we are automatically making them right by our lights about those aspects of the world. Now, I think myself, if you put those things together with a more detailed story of the conditions under which we can come to understand somebody, you see that there's no way we could get started with language or thought without already taking for granted that there are other people, that they have thoughts like ours, that there's a world we share with them, and so on. Oh my goodness, then skepticism can't even get started. But that's an insight that comes at the end rather than a project at the beginning.
Sure. The only point perhaps we might just pursue for a sentence or two more is the question of whether it's really so clear that agreement comes out even with relatively observational, let's not quibble over the term, sentences. So suppose that what is before us both is a rabbit, cunningly disguised as a carrot. And then it seems to me that the interpretation which would actually make the best sense of our interpretee, supposing the interpretee is not onto the trick, is going to be interpretation which says something like lo, a carrot. In other words, an interpretation which would make them out to be wrong, but all too intelligibly wrong. And I guess the worry that people have is, if that's so clear in that sort of case, how could we get any anti-skeptical virtues out of these principles, since if we're wrong in the way that the skeptic says we might, so to speak, be wrong, then we'll be all too intelligibly wrong.
Right. Let's go back to the learning situation in which somebody is picking up the meaning of lo, a rabbit, or lo, a carrot, or whatever. Here we pick a series of, as teachers, a series of situations in which we say, let's say, lo, a rabbit. Suppose that what we pick out by chance is never a rabbit, but always a carrot. What are we going to suppose the other person means or interprets that sentence to be about? Surely about carrots. It's hard to see how you can be wrong right from the start. As Wittgenstein says, the learner is in no position to question at the start. Is my teacher getting it right? He has no grounds on which to question it. Of course, once you get a whole lot of other things going, you want to fit them together, and you may go back and correct all sorts of things. But at the beginning, at the bottom, so to speak, the notion of error can't come in until you get started.
Okay. So this approach has obvious similarities with the idea that if we were unfortunate enough to be brains in a vat and so not to have had the requisite contact with rabbits and carrots, then our thoughts wouldn't be about rabbits and carrots. So that to the extent that one can so much as entertain the thought, it's correct.
There has to be a basis.
Can I just follow up, I think, to complete this thing? I have here the script from the previous documentary that we did with Professor Quine, where the similar question, if not the identical question, was asked of him. And he said, in response to a very similar question from Martin, that, in fact, I've got a contracted version. I'll happily sort of read the longer version if you prefer, but I don't think it's really necessary. This is my own contraction to it. What do you think of the idea that Davidson's principle of charity, that one should interpret another to make him or her come out true by and large, gives as a response to skepticism? Van says, I don't subscribe precisely to the principle of charity. I think that what should guide us is a principle of psychological plausibility. If we've observed in an alien society some outlandish ceremonies and rites, then it might be more plausible to construe an alien's particular sentence so that it comes out false, but fits in with his other apparently strange idea. But this principle coincides with the principle of charity to a large extent in that people are so much alike, even these exotic aliens, when it comes to practical things. And I understand there is about to be more discussion of this in print shortly, about precisely what Quine means by his principle of empathy or psychological plausibility as distinct from Davidson's principle of charity. And I wonder if there is any space between you still on that issue.
I couldn't have put it better if I were saying it today.
You don't mind the contraction then?
No. I think you probably improved it, although I can't remember the original text, but I'm not sure. We do empathize, certainly. The translator on the spot, translating the conjecturally the observation sentences, is empathizing. That is to say, he's saying, now, what would I say if I were in this position, looking at exactly what the native seems to be looking at? Rabbit. So Gavagai is rabbit. That's empathy. Thus far, however, he's not taking into consideration, although it would be an improvement if he did, I think, not taking into consideration peculiarities of the native point of view that would have psychological effects of distortion relative to his own. Seems to me that's another consideration.
I'm sorry, I can't argue with this. It seems to be right, clearly. And I mean, the more we know about somebody else, the better we're going to understand them. And the more we know about their education, their culture, their prejudices, and so forth, the more we'll get right about them. The thing I always want to add, though, is there's got to be an underlying similarity in the things that we naturally respond to in unison, and that in itself doesn't require anything I would call empathy. Empathy is frosting on the cake, so far as I'm concerned. Once everybody is a thinking creature and so forth, we can certainly ask ourselves, what would I say if I were there? What would I see if I were there? What would I think if I didn't have any eyes? And so forth. All of these things help and make our interpretations more accurate, and we use all of these hints and clues and general theories about how perception works and so forth in our actual dealing with other people. My idea of triangulation starts at a much more primitive level, where there are just two or more creatures reacting in unison to things that they perceive outside and reacting in unison to each other's reactions. And there's no room for empathy yet. It comes in once things get started and much more subtle and complicated. So I don't see a ground for disagreement here.
Okay. Well, we've been talking about epistemology a bit. I wonder if we could move to metaphysics, and particularly to the relationship between metaphysics and the philosophy of logic and language. It's a topic which we talked about quite a lot when we did the video with Peter Strawson some years ago. And just to continue the idea that we basically just ask the same questions in these videos, perhaps we could just put it like this. One approach in the philosophy of logic and language says that one should settle questions of linguistic categories, such as, for example, the category of proper name or singular term, in a purely logico-linguistic manner, and then one can use that to somehow read off, for example, which things count as objects. One can read off metaphysics from the philosophy of language. Another approach goes the other way about and says that giving a philosophical account of, say, name or singular term will draw upon some antecedently given notion of object. Now, we could widen the issue and ask whether, quite generally, philosophy of logic and language is a route to metaphysical conclusions, or whether rather the metaphysics has to be done antecedently before one, for example, starts doing semantics for a language. And within that broader framework, perhaps the example of the semantics of adverbially modified action sentences might be relevant. But I wondered if we could just perhaps ask Peter first to say a word about the metaphysics philosophy of language axis, and then Van, and then perhaps Donald would set his position out with respect to those two. Peter.
Well, singular terms in general and reference in particular go closely, not exclusively, together. And so if one asks what are the most natural designator of singular terms, one's asking what are the most fundamental objects of reference. And it does seem to me, has done for long, that the most fundamental objects of reference are spatio-temporal particulars, just as one of the most fundamental operations of speech and thought is identifying a spatio-temporal particular and characterizing it in some general way, or indeed a pair or trio of these, and characterizing the pair or trios in some general way. And this reflects the fundamental metaphysical, logical distinction between individual variables, if you like, or names, and predicates. Now, if that's so, then there is a fundamental connection between the ontological distinction between particulars and universals, or properties, or concepts, or whatever, on the one hand, and referential and predicative position on the other. And I think that is both a traditional association and an arguably well-established one. However, this doesn't limit the scope of reference, because the fundamental asymmetries between particulars and universals can be reproduced at a more elevated level between one kind of general item or abstract item and the predicates of that. So it seems to me that the fundamental logical relations, reference and predication, can extend its range beyond its basis to include abstract objects and their predicates, and indeed individuals, as I would say, of any type whatever. But that's an extreme claim.
But the basic case of the subject-predicate combination is to be understood in terms of the given ontological notion of a spatio-temporal particular.
And its properties or whatever.
Do you see the same order of priorities, Van?
Not quite, no. I think of the, from the point of view of ordinary language to begin with, rather than mathematical notation, our ordinary language, I see it as the essential pronoun rather than the singular term. Essential pronoun is distinct from what Peter Geach called the pronoun of laziness, which can be supplanted by its grammatical antecedent. The essential pronoun cannot. The essential pronoun typically, when we get things over into logical notation, is a variable that refers back to a quantifier, and then if you replace it by its English grammatical antecedent, you get something that repeats the quantification rather than referring back to the same old one, and that's weaker. So yes, the example I used in the most recent lecture that touches on this kind of thing was, if a bird hoots, it's an owl, and there's the it. It's an essential pronoun. You supplant it by its grammatical antecedent, a bird, and you get a weaker sentence. If a bird hoots, a bird is an owl. But that essential pronoun, I think, is what brings in irreducibly objects, so that one could say that, and they may be concrete, may be abstract, of course, in the ordinary evolution of one's own language or language in general. It's going to be the concrete one that makes the grade first, if not exclusively. Depending on the essential pronoun is equivalent, when we go over into mathematical notation, of course, to pinning it on the variable.
Well, Donald, which way around do the priorities go for you? Can you do metaphysics on the cheap, so to speak, by doing philosophy of language and then projecting to a metaphysical theory from there?
Well, I don't think it's on the cheap.
No.
Because I don't think it's easy. But, well, I should just begin by saying I don't think there's some one way to do metaphysics that's the right way. Noting features of language is an approach and a useful one and a good one. What we find, using whatever methods we happen to use, to be fundamental to understanding ordinary language certainly ought to be one way of finding out something about what there is, that is, what we're assuming there is anyway. And I'd say, given the other things I can say, really a clue to what there is. But that doesn't tell you how to find this out from ordinary language, and there it seems to me there's room for a lot of proposals. And I find myself somewhere in between Peter and Van on this. I think of artificial languages or formalized languages as getting whatever life they have from their relations to ordinary language. Formal languages are just sort of fancy artificial suburbs of real language to whatever extent we understand the formal ones. I am very much taken with Quine's idea of the essential pronoun, though he himself has done more than anybody to show us that this doesn't have to show up in the logical form in any particular way. For example, in variables explained away, he showed how to get all the power of cross-reference and so forth without either pronouns or variables. So you have to say, well, how do you tell then what the ontology is, given this one of these languages which has the expressive power of at least first-order quantification theory, and probably more than that if we wanted more. Here's a language that has more expressive, that much expressive power, and no pronouns, no variables. So how are we getting the ontology out of it? I think one way to do that anyway is to ask for a definition or theory of truth for that language. See how the semantics come out. If you can't organize those, then you're not sure what you've shown. And I once put it to Van, and I said, what do you think about variables explained away? Is this a language then that doesn't have any ontology, or is it just a variation on these other languages? Show me a theory of truth, and he did, but the theory of truth turned out to be pretty much like Tarski's, and it introduced the same ontology. So there I find a sort of convincing series of events that show there really is something absolutely basic about the role of pronouns or variables. We can hide it away in various ways, but it's still there.
I wonder whether there's more than one issue that we should take up, but I wonder whether you could just say a word more, or perhaps Van might want to, about the case of a language in which the apparatus of quantification of variables is not so obvious, namely a kind of a predicate functology where variables explained away, a kind of language. If the semantic theory is cast in a meta-language using just those same resources, that's to say, how did you discern, once you'd given the semantic theory, that the ontology was just as before, given that the meta-language can be supposed to likewise not wear its ontological commitments on its sleeve?
Well, yes, I go at it more from the other end, beginning with my language and wondering just where does reification set in. That leads to the pronoun or the bound variable. Then we know how to translate, say, predicate functor logic into this familiar one. Well, then you simply translate in reverse this criterion. It would turn out in that particular example that to be is to be denoted by a predicate. And in fact, that would serve equally well. It comes out equivalent to the value of a variable or value of an essential pronoun criterion. When we, on the other hand, we come to a language where we don't see any clean-cut acceptable translation into this familiar pattern of ours, where the best we can do in the way of translation is rather approximate, or it's a disjointed sort of alternation of various translations depending on details. Then I think we simply face the fact that these are languages, cultures perhaps, that don't have that sort of ideology, that sort of concept at all of object and denotation. I think we have to be prepared to find that. Maybe there are maybe there are such languages around, and we probably would have trouble translating a lot of. We would have trouble translating a good deal of what we say, and I can conceive of that difficulty being there, and to that extent, ontology itself becomes, from my point of view, parochial.
Donald, just now you talked somewhat about the relationship between natural languages and formal languages, and said that formal language was really the derivative case and natural language the most basic case. That might not be everybody's view, I suppose, and certainly in the area of formal semantics, it might be thought that the formal language is the well understood case, and we have to do an awful lot of work to bring that understanding over to the natural language case. So why don't we just have each of you say a word or two about how you conceive the natural language, formal language relationship, and I think we might ask Peter to go first on this.
Well, unlike certainly Van and also Donald, I'm no expert in formal languages or formal logic. I see what I do know about it little, the predicate, first order predicate characters, as a most elegant and powerful instrument which also helps to cast a great deal of light on our ordinary language. However, I don't think all of the distinctions which we should recognize, even structural distinctions, which feature in ordinary language, are represented adequately, or indeed in some cases at all, in the formal language. Of course, you can adapt and modify, you can recast some of our natural language sentences so that they fit into this formal framework. But, well, to anticipate a little what we're going to discuss later, I sometimes think this is, though it can be an elegant and ingenious, sometimes an unnecessary exercise. That's enough for the moment.
Indeed, Van.
Yes, here's another slant on the sort of thing I've been saying, which perhaps brings us closer to ordinary language, or at it from another angle. Whereas the less penetrating view of ontology or of ontological commitment would be that one way or another you're committed to regarding these singular terms as names of so many objects, one apiece. I say the place to look rather is the general terms, in other words, the predicates. And to be is not to be primarily designated by a singular term. We may not even have any singular terms in a language. You can get along without them, although it can be awkward. Especially for mathematics, it can be awkward. But to be rather is to be denoted by a general term. And using that standard and using the essential pronoun as a standard, we find that all sorts of things, good heavens, beasts of the fields, birds, all sorts of things, are completely nameless if names are singular terms. And then you get out to where there's not even a complex singular term that will pick the thing out. When you get to abstract objects such as real numbers, irrational real numbers, where there are innumerably many that cannot be specified in a finite chapter, however long, a single one of these inaccessibles can't be specified at all, and there are classes that are in the same fix. I think the nominalists, if they were worrying about terms like singular terms like justice and so on, but somehow excusing terms like Pegasus and Caesar, they were looking in the wrong place, and the place to look rather is predicates.
Donald, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more, but perhaps we could set things up by looking at what might seem at first glance to be a kind of a tension between the project, which says there is this well understood theory of semantics for formal languages. We're going to try and adapt that as much as possible to natural language, or perhaps putting it the other way around a little contentiously, to butcher natural language into some kind of form where those techniques can be brought to bear. But that is one view of a certain project with which at least your name has been associated, the project of truth conditioned semantics for natural languages. How do we reconcile that or combine that with the idea that actually the natural language case is the basic case? Because it looks a little bit as if you've got explanatory flow in more than one direction, indeed in opposite directions.
Probably so. The project of taking an analytic attitude toward natural language is not some invention of mine. It's been around forever. One comes across what looks to be, from a grammatical point of view, singular terms, where we find it pretty easy to agree that there isn't anything that they're naming or referring to. And that's old stuff. I mean, it doesn't depend on modern logic or anything of that sort at all. So whatever I've proposed along these lines is just a continuation of a very old philosophical technique.
But a technique which might have thought of the idea of a logically perfect language as the most basic, the most desired case, and as natural language as something which was an approximation that we had to live with, whereas I thought that you were rather putting the place of natural language, making natural language the central case.
Yes, I do make it the central case, but how much we get out of that depends on how explicit we can be about what's going on in natural language, and we have a lot of techniques for doing that, and trying to see if there's some way to squeeze the natural language, or see it as expressing what we do express in a formalized language, is one way of trying to bring out what we think is there. But I see flexibility all around here. I mean, is first order quantification theory the thing to do? Well, we understand it extremely well. We're very clear about it. We can give it semantics and so forth. So it's good if we can use that, because it will make some things very clear. If, on the other hand, we have something like a proof, or even just, let's say, a good reason to believe that there are things in natural language which we intuitively understand perfectly, but we see that you can't do it in first order quantification theory, well, then we better bring some new stuff to bear. Maybe a more powerful logic, maybe more logical resources. I mean, I have my own private skepticisms about that, but I'm open-minded. Show me, bring it on, and see if I understand anything better than I did before. I mean, people have certainly tried to do this. They brought on more powerful devices, but I usually find I don't understand things any better than I did before. But taste enters into every stage, as far as I can see.
It might just be interesting if you would say, apart from the devices which have to come in with context dependence, such as indexicals and so on, whether anything else going beyond the framework of first order logic you have been persuaded is an essential part of the picture.
Oh, well, let's see. One extension that, as far as I can see, is both called for and possible is to allow more kinds of quantifiers than just the existential and universal quantifier. I think Stephen Neal has shown how to incorporate in a perfectly clear theory of truth quantifiers like most and so forth. And that seems to be that's opening up a lot, actually. We hardly know how much it opens up, but that's just a suggestion. And of course, as you know, I think there are a lot of things that we ought to handle by recognizing explicit indexical aspects of ordinary language.
Well, we were looking at the one side of a triangle, the world, language, mind triangle, and we've been looking a little bit at the world language side of that triangle. Let's move briefly, as we bring this discussion to a close, to the language mind side of the triangle, and let's ask once again something about philosophical priorities. And very briefly, I'd just like to suggest that there are actually three different notions of priority, two of which have been very, very explicitly addressed in Donald Davidson's early papers. One is the question of, can one come to know about thought ahead of finding out things about language? So just call that epistemological priority, and essentially Donald's argued for a no priority claim. That's to say it's not true that one can come to find out the details of a person's mind without finding out something about their language. Then there's a claim of what you might call ontological priority, which is, well, can there be thought without language? And once again, Donald Davidson's argued for a kind of a no priority view. That's to say it's not the case that thought is ontologically prior. He's argued that there can't be thought without language. But I actually had in mind a third kind of priority, which you might call analytical priority. So the question I want to ask is, and ask each of you to say something about, do you think that notions in the theory of language, notions like meaning, can be analyzed in terms of notions in the theory of thought, like belief and intention? Or do you think that's not possible? So perhaps we might ask Van first what he thinks about that question, the analytical question. Can semantic terms be analyzed in terms of psychological?
In terms of belief as something into which, or by means of which to analyze them, I don't think I'd be much comforted if that were brought off, because it seems to me that belief is very much in need of rigorization and analysis itself. It's certainly, it's a notion we can't get along without, and this is true of propositional attitudes generally. I've inured myself to getting along without, when it comes to rigor, getting along without propositional attitudes de re, and the de dicto ones I've been able to put in a tolerable form, form that I can tolerate. But the verbs, as against the logic of the whole construction, the verbs themselves, to believe, to regret, etc., these are certainly irremediable, well, perhaps I shouldn't say certainly, but as far as I can see, irremediably vague and irremediably indispensable. And so this is where I go along with Don in his anomalous monism on those verbs. But but still, I wouldn't be particularly. I don't think I'd be particularly excited if I saw reduction of other things to those rather vague verbs.
Sure. So if meaning maybe could be analysed in terms of belief, that this wouldn't be a very great achievement because more or less both notions are in equally bad shape from
Yes.
your point of view. Peter, I think you probably take a somewhat different angle on this.
I have done. I'm not sure that I do now. I used to defend Grice's ill-fated attempt to reduce all problems of meaning to problems of psychological values. That doesn't seem to me likely to work in the end. So I've given up the hope, well, if ever I had it really, of doing that. Whether I've got anything to put in its place is another question.
Could you say a word or two about whether it was just exhaustion or whether you think there's a principled reason why that can't be done?
Well, partly I agree with Van. The psychological notions of question are irredeemably vague, whereas I'm not sure that I do agree with Van about this. The notion of meaning doesn't seem to be so elusive. So that's one stopper on the reductive program.
And if anything, that might motivate the other order of explanation, perhaps.
It doesn't do that for me, no. No, in fact, it seems to be an illusion to hope that you could explain either in terms of the other. It seems to me they go together. And just how they go together is a problem that calls for abilities greater than I possess.
Well, certainly your earlier views are associated very much with Gross's program would be incompatible with some of Donald's views, but why don't you actually say what you think about this, Donald?
Well, I always thought that Grice's attempt, to the extent that he actually tried to carry it out himself, of explaining meaning in terms of intentions, was both fated to failure or circularity, depending on exactly what route one took. But that even if it succeeded, there wouldn't be much point, because both of these are propositional attitudes. I mean, meaning something by what you say, intending something by what you do, are equally intentional attitudes, actually. And it seemed to me there's no chance of detecting one of these without detecting the other. So what if you could reduce one to the other, which I don't think you could do anyway, where would you be then, since they're equally hard, at least in the sense that in both cases we're trying somehow to individuate propositional attitudes. And the problem of individuation is exactly the same. I mean, we distinguish intentions and meanings along exactly the same lines, however vague they may be, and they're certainly pretty vague, though I would say they're equally vague, and I think there are things you can say. In fact, some of them derived from Quine to show that they're pretty much on a footing. Certainly, belief and meaning come out on just the same footing in radical translation, because you start with something like assent and dissent, which is an equal mixture of meaning and belief. I mean, you assent to something, a sentence, because of what you think it means and because of what you believe. And the result is that when you get a theory of translation out of it, you've got actually a theory both of what the person means by what he says and what he believes. So they seem to me to come out at the same time. So no point in trying to derive one from the other. The trick is rather to see how to get at any of these from the outside, so to speak. That is, without assuming that you've got some way of individuating attitudes. And the notion of assent and dissent are a way to start that process, as Quine himself has pointed out.
Let's just take one tiny step further. I mean, some of what you said in reply was along the lines of what would be the point because you can't get epistemic access to one without the other, and I wanted to try, if possible, to set aside, let's suppose we grant the no epistemic priority of thought over language point. I mean, the point might be, even though perhaps we agree that there's no epistemic priority and even no ontological priority, I mean, the point would just be that we're after conceptual elucidation, and if conceptual elucidation comes in the form of an analysis, it's worth knowing that.
Sure.
But I think that you actually think that it can't. That's to say that there can't be an analysis, quite apart from the pointlessness as you see it. There can't be an analysis of the kind that Grice was after, or Grice and his followers were after. Is it possible to say, in as it might be 2 or 3 sentences, why you think that's not possible, quite apart from being pointless?
Well, this has to be short, where the story is long. It's roughly the same reason that you can't get a theory of meaning just out of the notion of use. You can't get meaning out of use unless you specify what use you have in mind. And when you've specified that, you've already built the notion of meaning into it. The same goes for intention. When we speak, we've got 1,000 intentions, all of which are nesting inside of each other and related to each other in obvious ways. And if you ask now, which of those intentions is the one that's going to give me what the person means by what he says, then you're just going to find yourself going in a circle, because you say, well, I just mean that intention. I mean the intention to be understood as having meant so-and-so. And well, if you help yourself to that, you haven't gotten there. I mean, look, Paul did great work in relating the concepts of intention and meaning. And that's analytic work, and it's important, and it's interesting. That's very different from trying to get one out of the other.
Okay, so you're going to pick up Keith Lower at the front here.
Keith Lower. I was a bit puzzled by the responses to the question about skepticism. It seemed to me that the philosophical views of each one of the 3 philosophers on the panel could have been regarded as motivated, at least in part, as an attempt to answer skepticism, so that somehow the role of the skeptic was to bring out the primary philosophical assumption, which perhaps was naturalism in one case. For instance, in epistemology naturalized, it looks as though the naturalism is in fact an attempt to avoid the skepticism that might result from the failure of phenomenalism. And it looks like the principle of charity is aimed at dealing with skepticism concerning other minds. And of course, the discussion of induction in Peter Strawson's early work looks like it's aimed at an attempt to avoid skepticism concerning induction. And so somehow it looks like the views of all 3 of the speakers are more strongly driven and motivated by an attempt to avoid skepticism than their remarks about skepticism would suggest.
Van, would you respond to that first?
Well, that may be true. I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to me that I've been moved very much by a conscious motive in that direction.
You know how hard it is in a court of law to find out about intentions, purposes. I would say the same. I don't think very much of what I've said was driven by the desire to refute skepticism. It seems to me what you could say about all 3 of us is we were trying to get things right, and it turned out that once we thought we had them right, skepticism had nowhere to go. I mean, there's a history of attempts to refute skepticism, and we know what they look like. They look like Kant and Hume and maybe, depending on how you think of it, certainly C.I. Lewis and a lot of the empiricists. And none of us is trying to do the sort of thing that they were doing. If the historical attempts to refute skepticism are good examples of people setting out to do it, none of us is a good example.
I think I'm with Donald there. I don't think we were seeking to avoid or to refute skepticism. I think more to dismiss it. And I think, if I'm a bit different from Donald slightly, Hume wasn't trying to refute it either, but also to dismiss it. Okay. Indeed, there's one point on which I think I agree with Heidegger, surprisingly enough. He said once, Kant said, I think it's a great scandal of philosophy that nobody has established the existence of the external world. And Heidegger said, that's not the scandal of philosophy. The scandal is that people should keep on trying to do it. So, appalling as he is in most ways, he's not a scandal.
Keith, do you want to come back on that?
Oh, I guess I find naturalism a particularly interesting thesis, and I think of it, and I put it, a very challenging thesis. And it does seem that one great advantage of it is that if you assume it, then you avoid problems that the skeptic traditionally raised. So you're avoiding questions about, well, are we really justified in these beliefs about other minds, the external worlds, and so forth, if you adopt the position of naturalism. So I think you've made, I don't disagree with the panel. Of course, you're the experts on your own motivations, I think. But I think it is striking that the thesis that you've come to accept is particularly useful as a device for answering or avoiding, or if you like, dismissing skepticism.
Yes, I think that you put your finger on it, Keith. It's the great comfort of it is that you stop trying.
But that's not an aim either. It's a good consequence.
It's just a good byproduct.
Mark?
Mark Sainsbury. My question is primarily for Peter Strawson about skepticism. You said that any argument for skepticism would be useless because we never believe the conclusion, and any argument against skepticism would be pointless because it wouldn't tell us anything we didn't know. But the original question was actually how do you conceive the role of skepticism in philosophy, and I wondered if there wasn't another role which you've rather explicitly, I think, repudiated in your mention of Heidegger, which I think the other panelists are also turning their backs on, and that is that the discussion of skepticism might serve as a test of our conception of argument or reasoning, because suppose that there was a completely faultless argument with a skeptical conclusion, I mean one that we simply couldn't fault, we could find nothing wrong with this argument at all, wouldn't that show something about the character of our reasoning? Namely, that there was something unsatisfactory about it because completely faultless reasoning could lead to conclusions that we couldn't possibly accept.
Well, one would be more troubled by that thought if an argument which was faultless and led to a skeptical conclusion had actually been produced.
Well, there are certainly people who think they have been produced, so that sounds as if you're now engaging with the traditional enterprise of considering skeptical arguments and discerning whether they're fault-free or otherwise. And that does take you back into a certain fold from which I think you were at one point trying to extricate yourself.
I see, by acknowledging that if there were a faultless argument with a skeptical conclusion, then one would be in trouble, or at least have a work to do. But that could only be the case that there was a faultless argument, that is to say with true premises, valid steps, and therefore a true conclusion, which actually established a skeptical conclusion. That could only be the case if those conditions were fulfilled, in which case, if this were the case, then there wouldn't be an answer to skepticism.
Of course, what one expects is that there's the appearance of that, and then it would be a significant philosophical task to show why that appearance doesn't correspond to
You
reality.
take it, such as Cartesian arguments
For
from
example, yeah.
benevolent demons and so on. Well, it's not a very strong appearance, and I think the fact that one is, in practice, everyone is totally unmoved by it, which is our point, really, collectively, is enough to call for disregard of it. It's not much of an appearance, anyway.
Seems like a good place for that discussion to stop.
Okay, so then Barry, and then that's okay. Okay, one more question, Barry, and then we'll wind it up.
Barry Smith. Donald, I'd like to go back to the analogy you made between what Grice was trying to do in reducing meaning to belief and intention and the limitations of that, as well as some of the strengths, and your comparison with people who try to reduce meaning to use. You said, and it was helpful, that at least Grice showed how to relate these notions, belief, meaning, and intention. So could there be a similar urge to relate meaning to use? There may be no way we could reduce talk of meaning to talk of use without having to assume there was such a thing as the correct use or the meaningful use of a term. So do you feel that the same urge arises in your work to relate your truth conditional accounts of meaning to the use that we make of language?
Certainly. It seems to me that the two problems are pretty much the same. Relating intention to language is mostly a matter of distinguishing between different sorts of intentions. And that's the serious and interesting work that you can do. The same, I would say, about use. There are a lot of ways in which we're using language. And with one utterance, we're using language to convey a certain content to somebody else, if we can. We're conveying a certain force, that is, we're asking a question, making an assertion or whatever. We're trying to buy a car for the least amount of money. We're using language to do that. We want to do that in order to commute, and so forth and so forth. These are all uses. So the whole point is to distinguish between these different sorts of uses and then relate them to language. And Boston did a lot of that work for us, though he didn't quite describe it that way.
I'd like to thank Professors Quine, Professor Davidson, Professor Strawson. Thanks very much indeed.